Hello and welcome to our webinar series, Stories from the Archives. In this series, we explore the stories behind the treasures and unique family history artifacts found in the special collections here at American Ancestors, New England Historic Genealogical Society. My name is Trisha Labby, Events Manager, and I will be your moderator for today's program. American Ancestors and NEHGS is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We provide resources and expertise in nearly all aspects of family history, and we're pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. Our presenter today is Judy Lucey, Senior Archivist. Judy joined the staff in 2003 and works to collect, catalog, and care for the millions of individual items in the Stanton Avery Special Collections. Judy received a BS in Education from Northeastern University and an MS in Library and Information Science from Simmons College. She's co-author of the Genealogist's Handbook for Irish Research, contributes often to American Ancestors magazine, and presents frequently for us here at the Brew Family Learning Center at American Ancestors NEHGS. The presentation today will focus on some of the items and treasures from our collection that relate to the period of the American Civil War. At any point during the presentation, feel free to type in your questions in the Q&A panel. To access this panel, you can click on the Q&A button at the top or bottom of your Zoom screen. You can type and submit there, and we'll address as many of those questions at the end of the presentation. In this Zoom webinar, you also have the ability to turn on live closed captioning. So located near your other Zoom controls, you will either see a closed captioning button or a 3-dot ellipses button. If you click on one of those, you have the option to choose live transcription. This will enable the live transcriptions to show on the bottom of your screen as we talk. There is no handout for this lecture, but you will have access to a recording starting tomorrow on our website or our YouTube channel. So if you miss anything during our live broadcast today, not to worry, you can always review the presentation later on your own time. I'll also be sending a follow-up email to all registrants when that recording link is available, and I'll also include any other relevant links from the presentation today. So I think that takes care of all of my housekeeping items for now. Without further ado, I will pass things over to Judy to get started.
Thank you, Tricia, and welcome again, everyone. As always, it's a pleasure to share stories from our archives. And today, I want to explore with you some of our treasures related to the Civil War. So, as Tricia mentioned, we're only going to be talking about NEHGS manuscript collections today, but I do want to point out that our Wyner Jewish Heritage Center does have a single Civil War diary, which is online, and Tricia will be providing the link in the follow-up email. Now, our acquisition of Civil War materials began as soon as the war ended. Many of our items over the years have been donated by individuals who served or by members of their families. And since we primarily focus and collect materials related to families, much of our collection consists of personal family correspondence and diaries and journals. In other words, materials which provide first-hand accounts to the war, its effect on soldiers and their families. But we also have a number of military documents and some photographs, as well as a small collection of materials related to people of color before, during, and after the Civil War. Now, our materials represent both sides that fought, the Union and the Confederacy. And you can learn more about our materials by accessing our library catalog and our online digital library and archive. So our library catalog serves as the gateway to our holdings. It's the key to unlocking what we physically have here in the building. So what's on our library shelves and in our manuscript collections. Our digital library and archive, what we've done here is we've made available to you a small but growing collection of our manuscript materials. And so we're trying to bring that reading room experience into your home. Now, while the genealogical materials you find here are a benefit of membership and therefore gated, much of the materials are available to the general public, including our Civil War manuscripts. So I'm going to be highlighting some of these today in today's presentation. Now, if I had to pick from the record types that represent the bulk of Civil War materials in our collection, I would have to say it's family correspondence. And these treasured letters have been preserved and passed down through the generations. Recently, I was reading an online article that said that the Civil War taught Americans the art of letter writing. And for many young men, those husbands and fathers, this was really their first experience away from home and separated from their family for long periods of time. And even those who were barely literate turned to letter writing so that they could let their loved ones know that they were all right, what was happening to them, and to alleviate any fears or concerns they may have. So therefore, you will find in letters in our collection eyewitness accounts from the battlefield, that day-to-day life of a soldier, whether it be them commenting on marching, or whether they might be commenting on sickness and injury, or even death. And also life on the home front. What was it like to live through the Civil War? And we have many accounts of that. And also the sharing of family news, the concern from the soldier in the field, how is mother, how is father, reports from home as to how neighbors and friends and family are doing. Among the family papers belonging to William Pitt Greenwood Hayward, donated to us in 1975 by his grandson, there is a small subset or a collection of family papers belonging to William's wife, Susan Moffett, who lived in Batavia, New York, and her immediate family, including her brother, Henry Clay Moffett, whom you see here. At the outbreak of the war, Henry was living in St. Louis, Missouri, and he enlisted in May 1861 as first lieutenant of the 8th Missouri Volunteer Infantry. And initially he was just involved in recruiting missions, but then eventually he did serve in combat with his regiment. Now, Moffett's letters really do provide us with a very vivid and detailed description of combat, particularly around Shiloh and life on the march through Tennessee as a member of Sherman's army. In the fall of 1862, with the position of captain promised to him, he was leading his men in charge at Arkansas Post in Tennessee when he was wounded in the thigh. Now, the surgeon in the field could not remove the bullet, so he was sent to a hospital in Chicago, and he died there the following year in September of 1863. His mother and brother were fortunate enough to be present at his death. Now, this April 1862 letter that you see here, it was written from Tennessee to his brother, and it offers us a glimpse into personal family news. In his opening paragraph, he's very worried about their father, who in the last letter from home, he learns that his father is ill. But he also complains about how difficult his life has been on the battlefield as he's going without needed supplies, such as a tent and blankets, and even cooking utensils. And although they fought and won the battle, he does not enjoy sleeping in an open field without any of those supplies handy. There are several letters written by Henry's sister Susan to their sister Sophia, who was living in Denver, Colorado during the Civil War years. This letter, dated the 9th of October, 1863, is one of my personal favorites in the collection. Susan writes Sophia about the details of Henry's final days as related by her mother and brother. She writes about how they brought the body back by train to Batavia, and how they were met at the depot by many friends, and that they walked in procession behind the hearse to the Moffett home, where Susan and other relatives were being comforted by their many neighbors. She also recounts how dreadful the sight as she looked out the window and could see that hearse coming up the street to their home. And as she said to Sophia, it was too hard to bear. We also have letters, as I mentioned, from the battlefields, and I want to just show one of them because this is an interesting one. Among the collection of letters that Alphonso Pierce wrote is a letter informing his parents of his capture. Now, Alphonso was born in Windsor, Maine. He was the son of Varanus and Louisa Merrill Pierce. He served in the District of Columbia Cavalry, and he subsequently joined the 1st Regiment of the Maine Cavalry. On the 16th of September, 1864, he was taken prisoner at Sycamore Church in Virginia, and he died at that prison, Libby Prison, the same year. Now, in this final letter, which was written just a few days after his capture, he reassures his parents that he's fine for now. But it's the end of the letter that is very moving. As he writes, "And if we never meet again on this earth, may it be God's will that we meet in heaven." Now, you can explore more of Alphonso's letters and other letters from those who served with him online in our Civil War collections. Now, as I mentioned, we have a number of letters written from family and friends. So surviving letters from home to those that served really offer us a glimpse into what everyday life was like during the war. It can provide context into the lives of these men and women. What was it like to live through the Civil War? How did it impact these families? So these letters frequently mention other family members, and sometimes they mention neighbors and friends. They also convey a lot of concern about their loved ones' safety. And sometimes these family members, particularly wives or mothers or sisters, fathers, will share news of the war that's impacting them, that they hear about through newspapers or even locally within their town. Now, remember, the soldier that's out there in the field in the regiment is rather isolated. So he's not hearing the news of the war all the time. He may hear snippets. And of course, they know the news is being covered in newspapers, but they're too busy marching and going from battle to battle to think about that. So news from home about the war provides them with information. But overall, as a source for family history, these letters can be invaluable. They're very helpful research tools, and especially if you're looking to put some flesh on the bones of your family history. And I do want to say that I don't overlook the material created by others who may have lived in the same community as your ancestors did at this period of time. Just look at the example of what Susan Moffett provides us. For all you know, if you had an ancestor that lived in Batavia at the time, perhaps they were at the depot to meet the body. Perhaps they were in procession behind the hearse, or a neighbor comforting Susan and her family. Or if you know of letters and materials that survive for an ancestor that may have been in an ancestor that was in a particular regiment or company, those things can offer you what experiences that they may have lived through. Now, diaries and journals written during this time can also provide us with details of what life was like. Now, I've always been interested in the female point of view during this conflict, and I'd like to share 2 examples from our collection. So the diary kept by Hedwiga Regina Shober Gray of Boston, Massachusetts, was donated by a descendant in 1971. Now, Hedwiga's entries normally concern like her family and her social life, and like sort of a who's who of the well-known figures in Boston and Massachusetts in that particular period of time. But she also comments on contemporary events such as the Civil War. Here, for example, I'm highlighting an entry from her diary from the 22nd of September, 1864, and she writes about the recent successes of General Sheridan at Winchester, Virginia, and his defeat of the rebel force under General Early. Now, while Hedwiga is joyous over such good news of a battle won, she goes on to write about the dark side of all such successes. And that would, of course, be the losses that are incurred on the battlefield. She goes on to write her observations of what she saw in the following days, which were long trains of fire companies and ambulances heading down to Broad and Prince Street to the depot. because she knows the trains pulling into the station will be filled with the wounded from that battle. Also keeping a diary at the same time is Betsey Jennings Nixon of Marietta, Ohio. And this is one of my personal favorites. Betsey was born on the 11th of February, 1839 in Marietta to William Nixon and Louise Sheldon Nixon. She kept her diary from the age of 14 to 27. We have the original along with the transcriptions that you see here. And each of these diaries, both Betsey's and Hedwiga's, offers the reader an insight to different female perspectives of life during the war. Hedwiga reports on the news of the day and her own personal observations. However, Betsey's diary offers us a front row seat as she lived it. Her entries provide detailed descriptions of rural life during the Civil War and her struggles running a family farm, while her husband served in the 148th Regiment of Ohio. She also frequently requested local and state authorities for financial assistance. I want to highlight the entries from Betsey's diary from August 1864 because it's these entries that, at least to me, sum up not only what Betsey experienced, but her character as well. She writes honestly and freely, and you can tell the strength of her character by these entries. So she too, like Hedwiga, mentions Sheridan's victory at Winchester, although she records this in August. Sheridan was roaming around the Shenandoah Valley in August and September of 1864, so there were at least 3 battles in the Winchester, Virginia area, and I think she's commenting on one of the first. But like Hedwiga, while she notes the success of those battles, she also notes the loss. She also tells us that she's down to her last dollar, but she did write to the governor of Ohio for financial assistance, and we actually have his response in the collection. And it seems women in Ohio at this time who did not have farms, who could not make a living, were given some sort of financial assistance. But after receiving Betsey's letter, he extends financial assistance to all women whose husbands were serving for the state of Ohio. Now, if you would like to learn more about Betsey's original diary and her transcriptions, these are online. And lastly, I want to leave you with this final comment, which she writes at the end of August 1864. And she writes about the women that she gathers with near her farm. And she writes how whenever they get together, all of them are crying bitterly. But as she says, my eyes are dry as dust. Now, the American Civil War is considered the first major conflict to be extensively photographed. So not only were people doing studio photography, having their portraits taken, but you also had professional photographers who were now venturing on to the battlefields. And many of these images of the battlefield were widely displayed and were sold throughout the country. Here is a photograph from the Library of Congress of Samuel Cooley, who was a professional photographer. And it was not easy to be a field photographer during the Civil War. Cameras at that time were heavy and they were cumbersome and difficult to maneuver. They had to travel with a team of people and they had to use wagons because they needed a place, to develop their photographs. So they needed a darkroom. Now, in the early 1860s, the newest technology in photography was wet plate photography. And that was a process in which an image is captured on a chemically coated piece of plate glass. And this was a very complicated process, and it only was done by professional photographers. We don't have any photographs of battlefields here. Because we collect papers of individuals and families, our photographs from the Civil War era are mostly of individuals or husbands with wives or husbands perhaps with men with their children, etc. In 2009, we received a genealogical paper written by the great-grandson of Lieutenant Colonel Edward Thomas Sherlock, and he dedicated it to his great-grandfather's memory. Edward Thomas Sherlock was born in Ireland in County Dublin around 1829. And he came with his parents in the mid-1830s to North America, first settling in Ontario, Canada. But by the late 1830s, they were already living in Detroit, Michigan, where they remained. He was killed at the Battle of Chancellorsville in 1863. And according to family lore, he was shot off his white horse as he led his men into battle. He left a wife and 5 children, ages 12 to 1 year. And if you have an ancestry account, if you look at his public family tree, there is one for Edward. There is a link to newspapers.com, and in his obituary at the time, the local paper published his final letter to his wife. The term brother against brother has been frequently used to describe the divisions created during the war with North versus South. But in the Charles Lansing Bacon papers, it's actually cousin against cousin. These papers detail the descendants of the immigrant to New England, Michael Bacon, who was a settler in Dedham, Massachusetts. But it also focuses on one branch of the family, the descendants of Samuel Newton Bacon, who left New England sometime before 1850 and settled in the Albany, New York area. Here on the left, you see Captain Joseph Bacon of Massachusetts, who served with the 6th Massachusetts, and on the right, Private George Gibbs of Georgia. A branch of the Gibbs family, who had lived for many generations in Granville, New York, moved and settled in Georgia. And George is a descendant of this branch and served with the 1st Ramses Regiment Volunteers Infantry. This photograph of Ebenezer Thompson can be found in the Eben Putnam papers. Now, Putnam's collection is primarily concerns with genealogical research, and it focuses on the descendants of John Putnam, who settled in Salem, Massachusetts. Putnam was a great collector. So he not only collected things related to his Putnam line, but he collected documents related to, things of general genealogical interest. And it also includes over 100 photographs. On the back of this photo, it records Ebenezer's name, but it also provides us with some information that he served for the Confederacy as a chaplain, that he was in the Jefferson Davis Artillery, but that division of the artillery that was Mississippi State troops. And here, according to the what's written on the back of the photo, he's holding his son in his arms. Now, I am going to tell you that unfortunately, I could not find anything on Ebenezer and his service in the Confederacy. So are the details on the back of this photo correct? I have to say perhaps, but I'm not sure. I wasn't able to find anything. So always try to verify information that you find on the back of old family photos. The Cozzens family papers is really, it's just a small gem of a collection of family papers. They include 2 original Bible records and other original documents that document 3 generations of the Cozzens family of New England and a branch that went to New York. Here you see a photo of Henry Arthur Cozzens of Utica, New York. He was the son of Henry and Charlotte Marvin Cozzens and a veteran of the 24th Regiment of New York. He was wounded at Battle of Groveton, Virginia in 1862, and later on he was subsequently captured at Centerville, but he survived the war and died in 1926. Unfortunately, the Cozzens family would suffer considerable loss during the war. His father died in 1864 while serving with the 21st New York. His brother John, who also served with the 21st New York, died at Andersonville Prison. And his brother Marvin, who served alongside Henry in the 24th New York, died of his wounds in a Washington, D.C. hospital in 1862. In addition to letters and photos, we also, as I mentioned before, we have a number of military documents in our collection. Most of these relate to individuals who served. So we have enlistment and discharge papers, such as the one you see here for George Kidder of East Boston. This is his discharge paper, but we also have pension records, not only for those who served, but also for widows. And we have military orders, appointments, and commissions. We also have the papers of 2 Civil War commanders, and those include a mix of personal papers and military documents. This small account book is one of my favorites, and you'll see shortly why. It was donated in 1972 and was kept by Ensign Eldredge Kelly as a courier for the U.S. Sanitary Commission. Kelly was wounded during the war. He was subsequently discharged, and then he went to work for this commission. And he traveled by train between Washington and New York, caring for the sick and wounded. Many of these entries are much later. They're after Lee's surrender, but they do document the soldier's name, the company that he served in, the regiment, the state, and specifically the town or city where he came from. And occasionally there's a note on his treatment. So if you look at the arrow that you see here on the right, it's pointing to an entry for Henry Parquet of Manchester, New Hampshire, and it notes that his left leg has been amputated. But what's really interesting is what you find at the back of this account book. So you have a historical record of something from the Civil War, and then you have what his wife used, which was very practical, which was to use it to record her recipes. So you can find recipes for cakes and puddings and lemon pie. And on this page on the left is her recipe for taffy, and on the right are her recipes for canning fruits. I mentioned military commanders and having their papers, and I just want to highlight one. The papers of Captain Leander Gage King are a more recent donation, donated to us in 2008, so they were kept with the family for a very long time. And they were also the first to be selected when we received funding for digitization of some of our Civil War materials by a grant from the Cabot Family Charitable Trust. Leander was born in Oxford County, Maine in 1830. He was the youngest of 6 children of Samuel and Betsey Lawrence King. Now, his father died when he was very young, and his widowed mother, Betsey, died in December of 1839. So Leander was sent to live with Abijah and Louisa Lawrence Fletcher in Westford, Massachusetts. It was in Massachusetts that he met and married his wife, Sarah Frances, known as Fanny, and they resided in Groton, Massachusetts. It was in Massachusetts that he joined and enlisted in the Civil War and was eventually promoted to captain of Company C in the 16th Massachusetts Volunteer Regiment. One of the many interesting things about this collection is it really documents his service. So we learn, particularly from his letters, that he was captured in August of 1862 during the Second Battle of Bull Run. He was held in prison for a short period of time, but paroled a few months later. And then unfortunately, Captain King was killed on the second day of battle during the Battle of Gettysburg. The collection contains over 100 letters that he wrote to his wife that provide all sorts of insights into his movements and his experiences, but it also has more than 130 original documents related to his command. So the collection actually has broader research for family historians who may have had ancestors who served in Company C, and for military scholars as well. So here's an example of a roll of enlistment that's in the collection. And this was done in 1861 when the company was formed, and it lists the name of the officers and all that served. And so in this slide, you can see the back of that, and the names continue. So you can see why. Here's a list of names. So this would indeed have, genealogical research value for someone who wanted to learn more about their ancestors' Civil War experiences. In this allotment roll of Company C, this is a list of members of the company who wanted to reserve a portion of their monthly pay to be sent to the state treasurer of Massachusetts so that it could be distributed to whoever they designated, perhaps a loved one, to get some of their pay. And in the last column you see here where I have my red arrow, those names appear. So Captain King is the first entry, and he's requesting a portion of his pay be sent to his wife Fanny in Groton, Massachusetts. When Captain King was killed, there were people that raised funds, particularly O.N. Wing from the Groton area. And they brought back two bodies, not only Captain King, but his sergeant, Jerome Parker, who lived in the neighboring town of Townsend, Massachusetts. It details the list of the cost of the coffins, the cost to disinfect and embalm both bodies, and also the traveling expenses, traveling down to retrieve the body and also bringing it back. And so total expenses were over $300. That's quite a bit of money then. So you can see that his wife, certainly Captain King's widow or Jerome Parker's family, would not have been able to afford that. Lastly, there are several applications for pensions by his widow Fanny. The one you see here is granting her a pension commencing in 1866 to 1869, but there are others. Fanny would eventually remarry, and there's also her request for pensions again in the 1870s and again in 1916. Fanny died in 1933 at the age of 98. So when you assume that many of us that, here we are in the New England Historic Genealogical Society, so therefore we would mostly collect things from New England, and that is correct, I should say. But we also have Civil War papers representing the Confederacy. And the bulk of those papers, believe it or not, come from one particular collection, and that's from the Charles Carleton Coffin papers that were donated a year after his death in 1896. Now, Charles was born in New Hampshire in 1823, and he held a variety of jobs before the war: a surveyor, a telegraph and railroad expert, and subsequently a reporter. He also served on the board here in the 19th century at NEHGS, so he had a personal connection to us. But during the Civil War, he wrote dispatches from the front for the Boston Journal, and he was quite well known for these dispatches and had a considerable amount of fame. He was granted a pass with unlimited access to the battlefield, to the generals who served, even to Abraham Lincoln. And during Grant's 1864 campaign in Virginia, I think Coffin must have witnessed almost every engagement from the Battle of the Wilderness to Petersburg. And he was one of the first Northern journalists to enter the Richmond after the fall of the Confederacy, when it was occupied by Union troops. So during his time, as he's making his way southward through the remaining part of the war, he's collecting papers of the Confederacy as souvenirs. Because he was one of the first Northern journalists to enter Richmond, he ended up at the headquarters of the Confederacy. So there he acquired lots of documents, including several letters and communications to Jefferson Davis. This one particularly is from the War Department, and it's notifying Davis that the signal officer in Norfolk is reporting that the enemy is embarking troops in steamers which are heading seaward. There's also a list of missing, killed, and wounded of men that served with General John Marmaduke of the Confederacy and his expedition into Missouri from Arkansas in 1863. And also he came across some correspondence between a father and his son. H.C. Williams here is writing to his son Alexander, who was a first lieutenant in the Confederate Army. Mr. Williams is despondent. over the events of the war, and especially the events of the summer of 1863. You have very heavy Confederate losses in the summer with the Battle of Gettysburg and the fall of Vicksburg. He complains about the mismanagement of the Department of Southwestern Virginia, which was the military command in charge of Southern Virginia and what's now known today as West Virginia. And also commented on the weaknesses of the executor, which here I think he means the executive arm of the government, and some of the generals. Like, for example, he points out, what the heck was Lee doing in Pennsylvania when he should have been in Virginia? And finally, here's more evidence of Coffin's collecting habits with this Confederacy note issued at Sutler's Bank in Columbus, in Kentucky. In our final section of Civil War manuscripts, I'd like to highlight some of our materials representing people of color. Now, this collection is rather small, but it's varied and diverse. And they include papers of a slave trader, Ziba Oaks, also eyewitness accounts. And what do I mean by that? Well, people from the North recording in diaries and letters their experiences in pre-Civil War South and what they were witnessing. Also slave records in some family Bibles. Of course, the family Bibles are their white owners. Regimental records, and a small amount of photographs, as you see here. So in this particular record, this is a list of Negroes purchased, and it's part of the papers that once belonged to Ziba Oaks, who was, as I mentioned, a slave trader in Charleston, South Carolina. Now, as I mentioned when I was talking about Coffin's papers, as he was moving south and when he was in the Charleston area, he acquired a lot of Ziba Oaks papers. So we do have a lot of documents from this particular slave trader. And this list shows, as I mentioned, the Negroes purchased. And on the left, it has the date of sale and the name of the slave. And also on the right, it shows the name of the buyer and subsequent owner of that slave. On the 28th of April in 1874, Ethan Earl walked from his home here on Newbury Street, here in Boston, to our library, which was then located at Summer Street in downtown. And he donated this account book of the 1st Kansas Colored Regiment, Company F. So how did he acquire that? Well, Earl was the captain and commander of the regiment, very much like Robert Gould Shaw was of the 54th Colored Regiment of Massachusetts. This account book contains a list of the regiment's field, staff, and line officers, and the role of soldiers in Company F. But also, as you can see here, it has monthly lists concerning the issue of clothing to each of the soldiers. And in that particular volume, he also notes who's deserted, who's killed, who's wounded, etc. But the most interesting part of the account book is actually in the back, which is Earl's history of the regiment. He writes about the men who served under him and the respect he had for all of them. He also records and writes about the discrimination they faced and the racist comments that they received from townspeople as they marched through the South. One of the most interesting stories he shares is about Sergeant Clement Johnston. As he writes here, he was a Methodist preacher and former slave from Missouri, whose real purpose in joining this regiment was he was hoping that as it moved south, he could be reunited with his wife and daughter, who were slaves in Tennessee. And Earl doesn't disappoint. He provides us with a very happy ending, as the family was able to reunite when the regiment was in Fort Smith, Arkansas. Lastly, I want to share this document. This is from the Reconstruction era, and it's part of the Henry Augustus Pierce papers, which were donated to NEHGS in 1908. The papers deal primarily with the surveying and selling of lands in Camden and Hope, Maine. But Henry himself was a trader in the Pacific and a diplomat. And during the Reconstruction era, era made an attempt to sort of manage a cotton plantation in Mississippi. So there are surviving labor contracts with former slaves in Yazoo County, Mississippi. And it's very interesting to read through these. And I just pulled out some quotes. So here it says in the contract that they would furnish these former slaves with comfortable quarters, kind and humane treatment, and wholesome food. In addition to paying them wages, they would also provide them with 2 suits of clothing and medical care. So I want to leave you today with some information about caring for your family treasures, specifically your Civil War documents and photos, should you have any. You know, there's always, if you take the right steps, it goes a long way to preserving your family papers. And some of those steps are very simple to do. First of all, storing them in proper enclosures. What do I mean by that? Well, I'm talking about, getting archival quality plastic sleeves or folders and boxes. The other is if you have family correspondence or other original documents that are folded in envelopes or in other types of ways, you want to make sure that you remove the letters and other documents and store them flat. That's going to go a long way to preserving the documents, because if the longer you fold an original document, the chances of it separating at the folds and coming apart is greater. You also want to monitor your storage environment. Where are you storing them in the family home? And, life gets busy and we want to start, we put these things aside. We may not look at them for a long time, but you do want to check it periodically. You also want to think about long-term preservation and what other ways can I preserve long-term? And that is through reformatting your manuscripts and your photographs. Why would you want to do that? To ensure the long-term preservation, but also to share them with your family. And nowadays with the technology, you can capture this information with the camera phone or a low-cost flatbed scanner. However, if you have fragile documents in your collection that you want to preserve, it's important to talk to either a conservator or a preservation specialist, and probably have any fragile documents, if you want to reformat them, imaged by a professional. And speaking of a professional, a good place to start is on our website with this page, which is dedicated to preserving your family treasures, and it's free to everyone. It's created by our own conservator, Todd Patterson. And here you can access his free webinar on preserving your family papers. And he has a couple of how-to videos as well, if you want to try to do some things from home. He also offers preservation tips. And he has links to other resources online, including a list of vendors of archival supplies. So by taking the right steps now, this will ensure you the long-term preservation of your family papers and photos, so that, like what you've seen here today, you can also pass these papers and documents down to your family members.
Great, thank you so much, Judy. That was a wonderful presentation, a great look at what we have in our collection related to the Civil War. Before we jump into the Q&A session, I wanted to just mention a couple of upcoming online programs that I think will be especially interesting for this audience. Looking forward to the new year, we do have 2 events in January to consider. First, on January 11th, we'll host Brian Matthew Jordan with his book, 1,000 May Fall, An Immigrant Regiment's Civil War, as part of our American Inspiration author series here at American Ancestors. So with this book and presentation, you can see the Civil War from a new perspective. It's a really intimate and absorbing chronicle as it documents the forgotten contributions of immigrants to the Union cause. Also on January 22nd, we'll host another iteration of our virtual preservation roadshow with a number of our experts here at American Ancestors. So attendees will gain access to a number of recordings related to preservation to view on their own time. They'll submit photos of their own family history heirlooms for feedback, and finally attend a live Q&A with select staff on January 22nd. So two interesting programs related to the topics we discussed today. I hope you'll consider joining us for these programs and others in the new year. And with that, let's open it up to some questions. Go ahead, if you haven't already, you can type your query into that question panel and we'll answer as many as we can in the time that we have left today. To start us off, Judy, you mentioned at the end taking those next steps for attendees wanting to possibly preserve and care for their own family history items. So for those interested out there, could you talk a bit more about the process of donating family history papers or heirlooms to an archive or relevant repository?
Oh, sure. Well, like preservation, it also requires some steps. And the first is identifying what you have. Now that may seem silly, but don't we know what we have? Well, if you haven't really looked at your materials in a while, but particularly if you have original documents, say, for example, that reflect the Civil War era, you want to identify what those are. And then you want to think about, well, where should they go? And I always recommend maybe perhaps starting locally. So if there's a local historical society, perhaps in the area where your ancestor served or where your family lived, you can start with that. State historical societies, and I can think of two that come to mind, Minnesota and Wisconsin, who both have excellent Civil War collections and highlight each on each of their websites. And there are other places such as NEHGS as well. So thinking about where your ancestor served and where the family was from, and thinking about local repositories. But universities and libraries also have them as well, collect these materials. The next is to think about then is contacting a repository and finding out what it is, would they be interested in these materials? And you should make sure that they're going to ask you lots of questions, but in turn, you want to interview them as well. You want to find out about the repository. How are they going to care for the collection? Do they have an extensive backlog? What are their hours of operation? Are there volunteers that take care of this? Do they have any training in preservation, conservation, or their archivists, etc.? So you want to, kind of interview the repository that you're thinking about, if they indeed share an interest in wanting to acquire your materials.
Great advice there, Judy, to get people thinking about their own collections at home and how to best preserve them. It's great advice to look on a more local level. Going off of that, we had one question out there about our donation process, and someone asks, do you only accept originals of Civil War letters along with the photos of the soldier, documents pertaining to him, or would you accept scans? Could you talk about that a little bit?
We normally just accept the originals. However, if you're offering us digital scans, we would encourage you to think about giving us genealogical material with it. So if you have family group sheets or charts, we would want scans of that with the material. And then if we choose to put them online, we would need your permission to do so because we don't own the originals. We haven't really begun to accept a lot of original documents that are scanned. What we are accepting right now are genealogical materials that are digitized, and sometimes that will come with family papers. So we do have a policy in place to preserve such items. So again, it's going to just depend on what you have. Our preference is original, but we are open to discussing, what you have in digital format.
Great, thank you so much, Judy. We had a bunch of questions in the Q&A panel about the digitized collection. I
Mhm.
think people are, motivated and anxious to get started searching in there.
Mhm.
A couple of questions related to how this digital collection is, indexed and searchable. I don't know if you could speak to that a little bit.
It's a browsable collection. So once you go in to the first panel, and if you get into the initial screen of the digital archive library and archive, it will show you 3 different repositories. It will be the R. Stanton Avery Special Collections, the Wyner Jewish Heritage Center, and our genealogy books, the materials from our physical library that are digitized. So you could say, if you're interested in our Civil War materials, you connect or link into the R. Stanton Avery,
Mhm.
and that will bring up the tile screen that you saw. So you can click on that and browse through it. And then you'll be able to see what is actually there. There are a number of collections, some of them which I highlighted today. Another way to sort of identify what we have online is through the library catalog. Anything that's digitized has links embedded in the library catalog. So if you stumble across, you're researching Civil War, Massachusetts, 16th Massachusetts Company C, let's say for a description, it's going to pull up Leander, Gage, King's papers, and then embedded in that will be a link to it. So how are they indexed? Well, each of them are scanned and are fully searchable with metadata, the terms, the names, the types of material, etc., the subject matter, and then you can go in and browse. We do have a selection criteria in which, so for example, if the collection is all or the majority of the materials are related to the Civil War, they will get online. If I have a large collection of family papers, but only a very small amount is related to the Civil War, they will not be online. Okay, and that also, for example, the photograph of Ebenezer Thompson from the Eben Putnam papers I showed. Well, Eben Putnam is a huge collection, and it's mostly genealogical research. So it's not online, and anything related to the Civil War in that collection would not be. So we do have some criteria for selecting material as well, and what we put. And the last update to the Civil War materials was in 2019. But since the lockdown, we've cataloged another collection of Civil War materials, and we're actually in the process of processing a family paper collection that has Civil War memorabilia in it currently.
Great, thank you, Judy. That gives us a great idea of how to best use those digitized collections. I encourage everyone out there to take a look. Again, I'll be following up with any relevant links that Judy mentioned to make things a little bit more convenient for you. And I think that wraps up. I'm seeing a few other questions in the chat that are a bit more specific to people's individual collections or family histories. I do encourage all of you to, reach out to us, or perhaps if you're looking into your own family heirlooms, join us for that Preservation Roadshow event. But we do want to keep in touch as you are going about preserving your own items. A big thank you again to Judy for these fabulous stories from our collection today.
You're welcome. And if anyone wants to reach out to me individually, they can do so.
Great. I can include some of your contact information in the follow-up email as well, Judy. You're just a wealth of information, not just for our collection, but for preservation in general. With that, we'll wrap up. If you do have, again, more specific questions about your family history research, you may want to consider also working with our research services team that conducts research for hire. You can learn more about that by contacting research@nehgs.org. Additionally, you can go to americanancestors.org/chat to take advantage of our free Chat with a Genealogist service. This is great especially if you have quick reference questions. It's free and available to all, and the chat service is available Tuesday through Saturday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. They do chat late on Wednesdays until 8 p.m. So just a couple more examples of ways to stay in touch with us. Thank you again for joining us. And as you leave the event today, you'll have an opportunity to fill out a brief survey and give us your feedback as we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings. Any and all feedback is extremely helpful and appreciated. This free webinar was made possible by the generous support of members and friends around the world. Please consider making a gift to American Ancestors to keep these programs free for everyone. If you'd like to learn more about upcoming online educational programs, please visit our full events calendar at americanancestors.org/events. Stay safe, stay healthy, have a wonderful holiday season, and I hope to see you all on our online programs in the future. Goodbye for now.